Well, in any event, people are not here to listen to me, but I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Pierre de Vries, who's a co-founder of the Silicon Flatiron. There you have it, and who has been laboring diligently with me over these months to bring today's events off. And so I'll hand it off to you, Pierre. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you everybody for being here. You came for Scott Pace, you stayed for the lunch, and you stayed for us, so thank you very much for that. So the goal for this conversation is to think a little bit in more detail about the issues that Dr. Pace teed up for us, and to really explore how federal regulation and federal oversight can maintain US leadership in space in the Space 2.0 era. And we'll be talking about many things, but for me, the key question really is, what's going to be different going forward? And we have an illustrious panel here. I will just introduce them, give you their names, identify them. I can't talk faster than you can read, so I refer you to their bios that are in the program. And there you can actually see exactly how striking their CVs are. So on your left, we have Earl Comstock. Mr. Comstock is the director of the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning at the Department of Commerce. In the middle, we have Dr. Michael Mineiro, who is staff director and senior counsel for the Space Subcommittee of the House of Representatives Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And on my immediate right, we have the Honorable Robert McDowell, former FCC commissioner, but now a partner with Cooley LLP. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. What we're going to do in this conversation is we'll just start off with a conversation on the stage. I'll ask a few questions. The panelists will engage with each other, and then we'll move to audience questions when the time is right. So I wanted to start, Earl, with you. You know, you're actually at Commerce. Commerce is driving a lot of these things. You're in the engine room. How is the reform process going?
Well, thank you for that question, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody. It's going very well. Secretary Ross is, just incredibly enthusiastic about this transition, the way the National Space Council has been reconstituted under the direction of Vice President Pence. We have the full support of the president, which is just fantastic. So this has been quite, I think, an engaging process for him and one he's very excited about. So that's trickled down immediately to the department. We are moving sort of full steam ahead. Obviously, there's an administration process here, and that process is continuing through the direction of the Space Council. But at the moment, we are actively, as the Secretary has said, moving the Office of Space Commerce and reconstituting it back up under his direct supervision, and that's ongoing and making good progress. So we still have to go work with our colleagues in the Congress who have to approve the reprogramming, but we anticipate that will happen in the near term. And in the meantime, you definitely have the Secretary's full attention and focus on this matter. So I think for everybody we've got a lot of hardworking staff in the department who have long been working on these space issues, and they're very excited by the attention they're receiving and the input that the Secretary's had. So those people will all be continuing to work on these things, but they'll be moving up and working more directly under the Secretary, which will be, I think, a real benefit to moving the process along. And just to illustrate that, we recently had an incident where SpaceX, after their successful Falcon Heavy launch, people reviewed that and realized that there was a remote sensing issue connected with the second stage of that. And so as they went to launch another satellite, in the space of 4 days, literally, we were able to get a license moved through, which had essentially never been done. It did have a restriction on it, which caused them to have to turn off the feed. But the point was we were able to get through the process, get the license issued, and now we're actively working with them on a longer-term solution to this issue. Because obviously the Remote Sensing Act is more focused on cameras that can actually see Earth imaging very well, as opposed to simply the GoPro camera that's looking to see if you've had successful separation and deployment of a satellite. So we're trying to make those adjustments as we go along, but I think that just illustrated the kind of thing that can happen when you have this level of attention from the administration on the process.
Can you expand a little bit more? You were saying you're talking about the way NOAA used to manage, or does currently manage, remote sensing. How do you envisage that changing? What's the vision for how these processes will work?
Well, it's, as I said, I don't want to get too far out in front of the reprogramming, but basically there is an Office of Space Commerce. There was a director position there that hasn't been filled for the last, I think it's 10 years. Mm-hmm. So we're actively in the process of bringing somebody on board for that. And we're going to move that staff up. And again, as I said, the main difference right now is you have just tremendous focus by the Secretary and the Secretary's immediate staff on this process. What do we need to do to reform it? How can we work with the other agencies? I think over at DOD and transportation, they're getting a higher level of visibility as well. And so that whole process, really through the Space Council and the efforts of Dr. Pace and the Vice President, have I think just elevated the whole thing so that there is this attention. And as the Secretary pointed out, I mean, we literally got to the point where the U.S. lost the space launch business. And now obviously we're back in full force for the commercial side of the equation. And, there had always been the military launches and the government launches, but now we're back seeing a real revitalized and engaged commercial sector. And that's, I think that's getting everybody's attention.
One of the things you said was, you are pushing ahead, but you also need to look to the Hill for work that has to be done there. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about what's happening there? You're very much engaged. You can tell us what's passed recently and what's on the slate.
Happy to. I do have to make a disclaimer. I speak as I understand the committee's position, but I'm not speaking for the committee. And for the reporters in that room, that's an important distinction. So I'm not speaking for the members or the committee. This is my view as I understand it.
He wants to keep his job. Okay, so you got that? Got it, okay.
All right.
All on the same page.
All on the same page. So first, let me thank the Hudson Institute for organizing this. I think this is a well-timed and important event. There's a lot going on, and this is real help to the community to move the public discourse forward. With regards to the Hill, I'm happy to report last week the House of Representatives passed a bill that Chairman Smith, the chairman of the Science Committee, I work for Chairman Smith, was his signature legislation. And what that bill does, it's called the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act. It accomplishes two policy goals. One is to reform the regulatory and statutory construct that governs space-based remote sensing in this country. And the other is to provide a minimally burdensome but effective mechanism for the government to authorize and supervise private U.S. space activities to be in compliance with their Outer Space Treaty. That's the policy philosophy of the bill. So that's the great news, is the House has taken an action. It was a bipartisan voice vote, which essentially means unanimous consent in the Senate terms. And it's been sent over to the Senate. Another legislative activity that happened 2 weeks ago was the NASA 2018 Authorization Act, which was marked up out of the House Science Committee. So for those of you unfamiliar with the processes, it was introduced, it was referred to the Science Committee as the Committee of Sole Jurisdiction, and then we went through a legislative hearing to determine whether to send it to the House floor for consideration. It left the committee on a bipartisan voice vote. And so we now have a bipartisan 2018 NASA authorization bill for the House's, in its entirety, its consideration. From a policy perspective, it does many things. It reaffirms the exploration activities of NASA, like SLS, Orion, and the ground systems development, but also does some other things which are novel to the administration's positions in space. If you look at the president's budget request, he had a number of actions within that request he was requesting, which was designed to move the ball forward in the exploration agenda of NASA, to empower NASA to find creative ways to work with the private sector for services, for example, lunar services that could complement the science agenda of NASA. And there's also some discussion in there about what's the future of the LEO human spaceflight program and the requirements of NASA look like, particularly as it relates to the ISS. And that's a very important and ongoing discussion that the Hill and the administration are having. So those are the two major pieces of legislative activity that just happened within the last 2 weeks. There's also a smaller bill that was marked out of the committee on a bipartisan vote about 4 weeks ago, introduced by Representative Posey, called the Commercial Space Support Vehicle Act. This is an act that addresses a certain class of vehicles that can support a space flight, like a Stratolaunch or like a Virgin Galactic sort of airplane that might have other uses. And so that bill is designed to empower a mechanism for those uses to be provided to the public for compensation, but in a way that meets the other public interests. So those are the three major legislative activities just in the last month that's happened on the House side.
And so my understanding is that, to some extent, the action now moves to the Senate. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's usually how it works on the Hill. The Senate is the cooling saucer, I think they call it. So we're all
Very diplomatic for a House guy.
Yeah,
To say, so.
As a former Senate staffer,
Yes.
I'll
Let them duke it out.
that's right.
thank him for that remark. We do cool the temperate
Cooling it
activity in
down.
the House.
But at the staff level, I talk with both my Republican and Democratic staff colleagues on a fairly regular basis, try to maintain open communications. I hope that their members desire and move forward with the introduction of legislation on both of those fronts, on the commercial space front and on the NASA authorization front.
One of the things that I think we'll get into in more detail as the conversation progresses, but I just wanted to get you to speak authoritatively about, is the difference in the structure between the House side and the Senate side. So when I think about the issues in space, traditionally at least, the one is stuff is going to bang into each other physically, and stuff's going to bang into each other in terms of radio signals in receivers. So which is framed as space and communications. Now on the Senate side, I think it's differently structured from the House. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's and before I address the institutional constructs of jurisdiction, I think it's a relevant question for another reason, which is I think why we're actually on the panel today, which is what's happening that we're all talking about this. And so one of the things you'll see when I articulate the committees we work with on the House side and how the Senate is structured is that new private space actors, the private sector doing something new and novel, means the government's asking questions. This is a really good problem. If the government was the only one doing anything, we wouldn't have any laws, really. Right? I mean, maybe we'd have a few. But it's when the private sector goes out there that the public asks, what's the public equity in that activity? How do we balance those equities with the needs of national security or foreign policy or other needs? And so this is one of the reasons why there's this sort of interest now in a real debate, because people are doing real stuff, and that's exciting. And when you look at the structure of the House, I won't get into the nitty-gritties, but essentially the House Science Committee under the House rules has jurisdiction over outer space and control thereof. And traditionally the way that's been exercised is it includes oversight over NASA, it includes oversight over NOAA and their space activities, it includes oversight over the regulatory functions related to operations. So it'd be the remote sensing or the launch and reentry. The spectrum falls primarily into the Energy and Commerce Committee of the House. And so you do have this interesting observation from a spectrum perspective that you have two committees with relevant equities. The same thing when you look at the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, because the Office of Space Transportation is in DOT, but we are the committee that moved the legislation forward for the legislation that enacted the Office of Space Transportation. And if you look at the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Act that came through our committee, and so you have another committee that has an equity. If you look at the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee, on their face they have equities, right? The DoD and Intel community. And when you switch to the Senate, what I think is interesting, and the gentleman can speak probably more astutely than I can, is that the Senate Commerce Committees can capture the Energy and Commerce and the Transportation Committees on the House side and allows their members to look at the issue set from a jurisdictional perspective in a different way, and in some ways empowers them to address issues in different ways as well. And so that's the biggest difference between the two.
We'll probably get into some of these questions about how the equities get balanced, but I'd like to step back a little bit, Rob, you've actually been around the houses a lot. You've seen all the unintended consequences. You've seen how unexpected things can derail processes. Would you like to give a bit of a sort of a reality check on how this thing might play out or might not play out?
Absolutely. And first of all, many thanks for moderating this. Many thanks to Hudson Institute board member Margaret Whitehead for being a driving force behind this program, and for our president, Ken Weinstein, for allowing us to do all this, and also my fellow panelists. You know, when you're talking about space, you're talking about the infinite horizon, right? But we don't have an infinite amount of time. And by the way, I'd rather hear these two guys talk because I'm learning a lot. I'm taking notes, so I'll try to be very concise. But and you're very kind to a has-been unelected Washington bureaucrat, so I appreciate that. So when I was an unelected Washington bureaucrat at the FCC, kind of to your point, I learned a lot about unintended consequences and things that are unforeseen that will come over the horizon, and in this case, quite literally. So I had adopted early in my first term sort of this orphan proceeding at the FCC that was going to try to get more satellites up there, make the orbital slots narrower. I mean, it was thousands of miles between satellites, an object that might be the size of maybe a bus, or even smaller. Of course, some are much smaller. And we could see the technology that was coming, that they were getting smaller, and gosh, couldn't we squeeze in just one more in per slot? And this hadn't been a priority for the FCC chairman at the time for a variety of reasons. Other matters just took priority. And so, you know, what are the odds of, you know, these satellites hitting each other when they're thousands of miles apart and they're so small relative to their orbital slots? And right as I was starting to get a little bit of traction, a dead Russian satellite smacked into an Iridium live satellite. And well, that was the end of that. So that was the end of my little initiative to try to get more satellites up there. So it was the essentially greater odds of maybe being struck by lightning, which actually is not good. I mean, it's you could get struck by lightning pretty much more easily. But now, since then, we've seen the skies, the heavens fill up with all sorts of debris. And that is going to be an ongoing issue that I think drives a lot of the policy here. And that is a classic place for government, national governments, but also intergovernmental bodies to focus on. And so one of the great, one of the products or byproducts of this great leap in innovation and investment is things like orbital debris. And how are we going to get your satellites, you know, just to launch past that cloud, or what's going to crash into other things, among many, many other things. So there are so many issues here at play: geopolitical issues, environmental issues, economic issues, privacy issues. I mean, when you talk about space policy generally, really it is infinite in terms of the number of public policy issues here.
Are there ways to prioritize?
Well, some of that's political, right? So some of it's a matter of engineering and logistics and what's necessary and what's going to be necessary in a time horizon of 5 to 10 years. And some of that's going to be just the political aspects. And I don't mean big P necessarily R versus D, Republican versus Democrat, but of just which committee is going to have jurisdiction, who's going to be driving it in Congress, or which office of the executive branch or independent agency where I was. So there are a lot of piece parts of government here that determine this mosaic we call space policy. And it really needs to be much more comprehensive and streamlined. As Earl and Mike were both pointing out, you know, as there have been great leaps and bounds, we have new and novel technologies, but government has not really kept up with trying to figure out how to deal with all this. And it's going to have to, because it's going to become an increasingly part of not just our economy and our lifestyle, but throughout the developing world as well. And so you're going to have 194 nations all very interested in space policy, and they will all have their own agendas.
We'll come back to the World Radio Conference. I just want to turn to Earl, because we've now touched on this thorny subject of space debris or space safety. One of the actions that you've taken is to actually, have the plan to move some of the activities out of the DoD into the Office of Space Commerce. Could you say a little bit more about what the philosophy is there and what you think one can achieve by doing that?
Well, thank you for the question. And obviously, the sort of explosion of activity and the potential for debris, pardon the pun, but is part of the driver here. I mean, essentially, DoD has done a fantastic job of providing sort of a public service all this time in terms of tracking objects in space. But now, as there's more and more actors, they would like to find a civilian agency that would undertake that mission. So they'll continue to be involved, obviously. They have the resources and the capabilities to track all these things. But then in terms of providing an interface and hopefully a two-way mechanism, there already is feedback coming into the DoD from various companies as to what's up there. But again, as that expands, they look at this and say, this isn't part of my core mission. This is sort of an ancillary service. There really should be a civilian agency that's the public face of this. And so that's one of the objectives that the Space Council identified is how do we transition this process, continue to maintain the resources of DoD doing this, but relieve them of the burden of having to interface so much with the public. And that will now take on a civilian agency face, which will be the Department of Commerce. And we're excited about that role. It's going to be a challenge. I think many of you are aware, I believe it's the European Space Agency has actually got a test running up there right now where they're going to actually deploy something and try to capture some space debris and bring it back. One of the things we'll be looking at in the licensing process, either through the legislation or through whatever capabilities the administration might have, is how do we ensure as more and more people go up that there is essentially I guess to borrow a philosophy from the environmental side, pack it in, pack it out. I mean, take whatever you take up there, bring it back.
Yes.
And don't leave it floating around up there for others to run into. So we're obviously looking at that issue right now and trying to figure out what are the mechanisms. I think that the core objective that the Space Council has is really how do we keep the United States as the flag of choice for companies that want to go into space. We would like to get these companies to come here and launch, and I think there's a real logical reason for that. As has been pointed out, under the Space Treaty, there is an obligation to licensees, and I think what we want to ensure doesn't happen is that we see essentially flags of convenience pop up all over the world. People just say, give me $1 million or whatever the price may be, and we'll put our flag on and send you up without any sort of oversight or assurance that there's going to be responsible space practices. And so that's a real objective that the administration has.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting, when you say flags of convenience, is forum shopping, offshoring, the kind of things that we're trying to avoid. One of the things that is intriguing is where to strike the balance between making it easy for people to operate and then creating an environment globally where there are responsible actors. So one of the things, for example, Mike, that I noticed in the House Resolution 2809, the approach is essentially self-certification and a presumption that approval will happen, which is very good news for companies that want to innovate and want to get ahead. Now, if I compare that to the way the FCC, for example, works, that's not the way the FCC works. To what extent will you see this creating a race to the bottom, where the US's environment is so permissive that other countries will also create permissive environments, countries that don't have as strong institutions as the US does?
Right. So let me just touch on a few points to answer that question. So first, at a meta level, I think what's really interesting is that the administration and HR 2809 and the House position align to the following principle, which is the United States should be the jurisdiction of choice for foreign investment and for people to come here and to create and build businesses in space. At the same time, there's a recognition that there's national interests, including compliance with our international obligations, that needs to move forward. Now, you can debate the specific language in the Free Enterprise Act, HR 2809, but that's the policy philosophy. Now, there is language in there designed to strengthen the international regime. If you look at how the definition of who is captured under that regulatory schema, it's designed to prohibit flags of convenience. So if you look at how other states have interpreted their treaty obligations to authorize and supervise, some states will say, if you go to another country, right, and it's kind of not our problem. So I won't name the states, right? But there's a few states who basically said, we're not going to worry about authorizing and supervising you, and we'll launch you. Some states will launch without authorization and supervision. And so one of the things that that bill does, and I don't think it's very technical so people don't talk about it, but actually strengthens the ability of the treaty to function. And it tries to plug gaps, which is a really useful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that struck me, just to go back to Earl for a second, you said, you know, you're excited, but this is going to be a challenge. And, you know, one of the things that strikes me as perhaps a challenge is just doing all the approvals as this business gets bigger. How much resource do you need in the Office of Space Commerce to do all the work that you see coming down the pike?
Well, I don't know that we have an exact number, but obviously we're looking ahead to both possibly a modification in FY19, and then obviously all of the administration is starting to prepare the FY20 budget. So certainly by then we expect to see an increase in resources. As I said, we have a reprogramming request that'll be going up shortly, which will allow us to get some more resources if the appropriations committees approve. So I mean, we're seeing this sort of ramp up. You know, fortunately, we're trying to match the private sector as it expands and as more is developed. You know, to your point about what will prevent the flags of convenience, I just draw back. Don't forget, as novel as space may be, this is much like some of the conversation that goes on with the internet. It's not so novel. You know, there's a lot you can draw to from maritime experience, and frankly, in the maritime world, one of the key drivers was insurance. And I anticipate that as the industry gets bigger, the insurance community will see a financial opportunity, but we will look to things like insurance to try to drive some of this so that you, in other words, if you set up a regime where the United States is, you know, sort of has a clear oversight mechanism, to Mike's point, that's not onerous, but that facilitates business, and they see that, look, if you go to the United States and you go through their process, we, the insurance community, have a certain certainty that, you know, that this is not just a fly-by-night operation, that somebody's taking a look at this, there are reasonable measures in place. We're hoping that the insurance community then will step up and start putting pressure on, you know, responsible companies to say, look, if you want to do this, if you go to this flag of convenience, no insurance. If you go to the United States, you'll be insured. And so there are market mechanisms out there that we intend to try to facilitate. And like I said, there are examples that you can look to. And then obviously, as the United States builds up what we would consider the best practices, we'll be taking those to the rest of the world, saying, this is the way a responsible state should do that. And we anticipate that, you know, the EU, Japan, will all follow suit and or work with us to develop common goals, and then hopefully that will translate into the rest of the world as well.
If I may follow up, I want to clarify something. You talk about the race to the bottom, and the question is, what race to what bottom, right? So what do I mean by that? So if we can go back to the Free Enterprise Act, because I worked for the committee as their bill. So I'm going to go back to that for a minute and then talk bigger policy. So in the Free Enterprise Act, there were basically two policy thrusts. One was to reform the existing remote sensing regulatory system. So that reform in and of itself had to do with restructuring how the system is balanced for or against presumptions of approval or denial on the basis of national security. And when the regulatory schema was created under Scott Pace's tenure in 1992, when the law was enacted and then put into place by regulation in 93, there were literally there's no one up there doing anything, and they were just starting. And so it made sense to say, hey, this is a Cold War technology that we don't know what the implications are for the United States interests. So we're going to presume there's something wrong, like a prescriptive principle here. You fast forward 25 years, and it's become more of an information technology that fits into a broad ecosystem. UAVs, in situ, airplanes. It's one of many ways people get information. And so the question for the members I serve was, is the balance from 1992 still the right balance? And their answer was no. They said we need to shift the balance and allow it to be more like this, more of a true balance. And the way they did that is they put the burden on the government to provide some evidence basis on why a license should be conditioned or denied for remote sensing, which on its face seems reasonable if you believe that you want to empower people to move forward and innovate, and at the same time balance the public equity. So I think in the remote sensing arena, there's no race for the bottom within the United States. However, I think countries that don't have any national security equities can immediately start at the bottom. So if you're a country that doesn't operate anything in space or you don't care about national security space, then you have no incentive to ever provide any condition at all. And so the United States, in a way, it takes the high ground. It's self-interested, but it's the high ground. Now, when we're talking about the second provision of the bill, it does a very discrete thing to very discrete issue. And that has to do with creating an explicit authorization schema to meet Article 6 Outer Space Treaty compliance. Now, if you get in a time machine and you go back 3 or 4 years ago, there were 2 companies in America who wanted to go and do things operationally in space. There's Bigelow Aerospace. They wanted to go up there and get permission to put a hotel up there. And then Moon Express, which is a moon rover company. At the time, it's still today, there's no clear explicit authority for any government agent to provide on-orbit regulatory authority to assure treaty compliance. And so Moon Express ended up going to the FAA because they were going to be on an American licensed launch. And under the FAA's rule structure, if no other government agent has provided a license or permit to authorize the activities up there, the FAA gets an opportunity to look at that payload, not only for public safety, or the safety of people on the ground, but also for foreign policy and national security. And so that's how Moon Express in 2016 got up into space. But the press release from the FAA was very explicit. You go to the very last paragraph, and it says, we cannot promise in the future we'll be able to authorize a payload on an American-launched vehicle because we're not sure we're going to be able to assure we're satisfying authorization and supervision under the treaty. And so a number of ideas sprouted up. They all had a similar theme, which is you create some way for the government to look at what's going to be proposed to be operated in space and allow the government to make a decision whether or not it meets the treaty obligations of the United States. And so HR 2809 the idea behind it is one way to solve that problem. The way to solve that problem in that bill is to give it to the Department of Commerce. It's very consistent with the administration. It was actually a year before the administration proposed all of this. But the idea was give it to Commerce, elevate the Remote Sensing Office, elevate the Office of Space Commerce, consolidate them under the Secretary, and then allow for this additional mechanism, which is minimally burdensome, for people to get the necessary authorization to say we're compliant with our international obligations. Now, reasonable people can disagree whether you need to add on top of that, or you want to make it a more coercive regulatory structure. But that was the philosophy of it. And to note about the race to the bottom, to my knowledge, not one country has ever demarched the United States to date that it's not in compliance with its treaty obligations. And so here's the United States trying to take a step forward, even though no one's ever called them and said, hey, you're violating your treaty obligations. So to the United States' credit and to the House's credit, they're actually trying to move the ball forward on behalf of the international community.
So that's, I think, a very good example of trying to establish best practices ahead of the game so that other countries could follow. I mean, there are many moving parts here in terms of agencies. You've mentioned the FAA here. We've got Commerce. I'd like to turn to the FCC for a little while, and actually to go back to geopolitics. Commissioner McDowell, I'm sure, has spent many sleepless nights in the bowels of a hotel in Geneva at World Radio conferences. You've seen how difficult it is, I'm sure, to negotiate with 192 other countries. How do you see that playing out, particularly with space and satellite communications? What are our geopolitical contexts here?
Yeah, and so just like, we talk about space policy and it's glamorous, and then Earl pointed out the very practical application of insurance law and how that quickly becomes mundane. You're like, oh, really? This is going to be an insurance policy conference? But it does then boil down to the variety of interests of all the member states of the International Telecommunication Union. There's no S on that one, Telecommunication Union, just one, communication. And the World Radio Communication Conference. We have one coming up next year. So the work, as we call it, Work 19, is coming up. And so for those who don't know, or those who are playing at home, you can't just launch a satellite and anytime you want. There are orbital slots that are regulated by treaty. There are radio frequencies that they use for the operation of the spaceship, as well as whatever its core function is. As well, those are also governed by treaty. There is harmonization, and also national governments within national governments. So trying to find consensus, it takes years. As soon as one work conference or treaty negotiation is resolved, you immediately start the next one, essentially through working groups, and it's an ongoing process. And as has already been pointed out, so if we look back at the 1960s, I was born in 1963, so it was the space age, and that all seems so quaint now. That was the space age? That's like the old video game Pong. That's the state of the art of computer, gaming. So obviously we've come very far since then. And other countries, back then it was the Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States. And now it's far more countries that are involved in this game, both with their own launch businesses, their own operations, as well as just gaming the system maybe for other purposes. So they all have a stake in this, or they want broadband in their developing country, and they want to proliferate more low Earth orbit satellites that might help deliver that more cheaply to their population. Or they don't want broadband because it's an authoritarian regime, therefore they're going to try to thwart that. So you have all those counter pressures going on all the time. And then you've got business interests. You have satellite operators, you have mobile broadband providers, you have the unlicensed community, some of which can be all the same, but you have a lot of different constituencies, governments, a lot of different constituencies within the radio frequency neighborhood, right, as to who wants what for what frequency. As we've seen these higher frequencies over the past 10 or 15 years especially, that have traditionally been used for satellites, now there's a big push for a lot of those frequencies to be used for terrestrial mobile broadband. And that drives tension as well. So it becomes much more complex. As far as I know, Earl, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, we're still looking for a work ambassador. I don't know if one's been appointed yet. So any volunteers from the audience, feel free to let us know. They're still looking for one.
I mean, you mentioned going up to high frequencies, and I think that's one of the things that struck me about the conversation about space. I thought that, the big issue really is space debris, and the stuff that I'm interested in, which is radio interference, is secondary. But it turns out that the satellite industry is very, very exercised about what's happening. In fact, in the US preparations for what's going to be happening in Geneva yet next year. And that goes to the balance between terrestrial interest, 5G, anybody, and satellite. So how should one think about making that trade-off?
It's very difficult. First of all, just in the debris part, there are thousands and thousands of piece parts up there. It's a cloud, right? Mm-hmm. And just to be able to launch a satellite through that, it gets more and more treacherous every day, right? So how do you resolve it? It's small p political in a lot of ways. I mean, when I was a commissioner, I always liked to defer to engineers. Like, I don't care what various business interests want. Tell me if this works or doesn't work. I don't know how much analysis like that is still done. I've been out of government for 5 years, and I know with these gentlemen, there's a lot of let's work on it from the merits. But it is very intricate and not easy by any means.
I mean, one of the things that's striking there is that the regulatory business model is different for the satellite industry and the cellular business, because the cellular business gets its license by auction, whereas satellite doesn't.
Well, I think you raise, I'll jump in here for just a bit, but again, from the policy perspective, I think there's a couple of things that everybody needs to keep in mind. And obviously this is something within the Department of Commerce, the NTIA is taking a close look at. The challenge for satellite is obviously it's typically a global operation. And even on things like 5G and terrestrial, there is a lot of effort to harmonize sort of things for the convenience of people moving around. But you can put in different chips and operate in different bands sort of globally. For satellite, your challenge is that you're typically sending a much weaker signal from space. And so there is, particularly as we get smaller and smaller devices and smaller power levels, if you're going to utilize that, you do have to have this global coordination. It's just not possible, and would frankly be a huge impediment to business if people had to go country by country by country to get authorization. Whereas in the terrestrial communications world, at least to this day, things are still done much more on a country by country basis. So it's not, the companies typically operate more in that kind of footprint. So I think there is a distinction, and that's recognized in US law, in that, yes, we don't auction the satellite spectrum, we do auction the terrestrial spectrum, different business models, different approaches. I think from the Secretary's point of view, and certainly from the fact that it's recognized in the recent Space Council documents, there is a concern within the administration that we need to make sure that as we go forward, and we obviously want to facilitate 5G, we want to facilitate broadband, but we also want to keep an eye on the future of, if we're going to have this expanding space market, we don't want to discover that we've basically stunted the growth of that market by denying it the spectrum that it might be needed for those transactions. So it's going to be a balancing act. It's going to be something that people have to take a hard look at. But we are very cognizant of the fact that when you're looking at the space regime, we are looking to the future. We're looking at an expansion of this, a very significant expansion. And so we want to move very carefully in terms of any changes that might end up shortchanging that ability to move forward in space.
To pick up on your point about denying access because of interference issues, just circling back to the denying physical access question, we were talking a little bit earlier about debris. As I understand it, there's the terms are space situational awareness and space traffic management, right. Which to me really is just the difference between what's up there and what do we do about it. My understanding is that so far the administration, and in fact the legislation too, I think, has given some pointers on space situational awareness, moving the public-facing function to the Department of Commerce. How should we think about the traffic management though? Because again, there's a number of different ways to do that. There are a number of different agencies in the game. Can you say anything about the outlook?
Again, that's an area that is being looked at heavily by the Space Council, and we're looking to develop that. I think much as the approach in the House bill, the initial approach will be to try to basically set out best practices and not look at an extensively regulatory regime. But obviously that, as we learn from the situation, that could change. But the goal of the government and certainly what the DoD has been doing in the past is, as we see potential collisions potentially arising, they've been very good about notifying operators to say, hey, you may want to take a look at this. The challenge, as I understand it, and I'm not an engineer, is they can sort of project out, okay, if this object continues to go that way and this one goes this way, it looks like they might collide, but you're talking about something where we don't have super precise measurements in space. So they can basically alert people that you might want to take a closer look at this. You're the operator of this object, so your call as to whether you follow the instructions, but they definitely give you a yellow flag, that you ought to take a look. And we intend to try to continue that practice.
Yeah, if I may, just to follow up on that. So neither the House nor the Senate, to my knowledge, has introduced legislation in this Congress specific to space situational awareness or space traffic management. I think the only quasi-exception is, and you can go look and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the NDAA is marked up in the Strat Committee on the House side last week, had a provision specific to this telling the DoD.
TAA?
The National Defense Authorization Act of 2018 had a provision in the MARC, the subcommittee MARC, directing DoD to get out of this business of being the public service provider within X number of years. I don't want to misquote the bill, but it's essentially what I think is happening in the Strat MARC that happened last week. So the reason I wanted to highlight that is, at least for the members I serve, they've not taken a position. So there's a lot of trade space about everything from roles and responsibilities to what are we doing and why. Now, from a cognitive framing perspective, the way I try to frame it internally to help explain things and to work through problems is as follows. There's really three policy issues: science and technology, space situational awareness, and behavior. You can call it management or you can call it behavior. I call it behavior. And when you look at those three buckets, you begin to look at the problem set differently and the solution set differently. So for example, Earl referred to the fact that on the S&T side, we have a fundamental challenge of even having sufficient knowledge of where things are at with sufficient fidelity to know whether or not to move. So that has to do with everything from in situ measurements of debris to working with algorithm development, to working with big data problems, with improvements on fundamental technology for radar. There's all sorts of things you can do to solve these sort of science and technology issues. And that's one policy area we need to focus on. The next one, which is what DoD currently does under 10 U.S.C. 2274 authority, commonly known as sort of the public SSA services, is if some SSA, Space Situational Awareness, is the DoD free of charge will help people, if they ask for it, to be warned if there's a possibility their satellite is going to hit a piece of debris or another satellite. And so from an SSA perspective, Space Situational Awareness, there's a number of questions we have to answer. If the DoD isn't going to keep doing this, which government agent, or if any government agent will do it? Do we need a government agent to do it? If it is a government agent, what agent and to what end? How, if at all, should the private sector be involved? And how do these activities relate both to the S&T function and to the behavior function? And that comes to the last bucket, which is within the question of behavior. This is where people really get interested, because what you're really talking about ultimately is, what do you want people to do up there? Do you want them to turn left or right to avoid each other? Do you need to force them to do it, or do you need to incentivize them to do it? Do you want people to develop ways to minimize debris falling off? Do you want them to force their satellites to go back into the atmosphere? It's really about behavior, how you make the thing, how you launch the thing, how you get rid of the thing, how you operate the thing. And so in the behavior spectrum, you have all these different tools you could use depending on your perspective. You could have non-coercive bottom-up behavior, like a standards development construct. You could have coercive bottoms-down behavior, everything from an international regime flowing into a domestic regulatory schema. When I look at all this, the one model that seems to make sense on its face is how we did the orbital debris mitigation guidelines in the 80s and 90s. And what we did there is we got a bunch of technical people together at the NASA and the agency level, and they said, what are some technical standards we should follow? They socialized those with their like-minded space agencies, and then in the 90s, they came up with common technical standards, which were then adopted in domestic regulatory schema, and then were floated into an international consensus building process through the UN. So it took about 25 years to get to a point where people felt quasi-comfortable there was a consensus on basic space debris rules. So is it going to go that way? I don't know, but this is, in my mind, these are like the policy buckets and the policy issues that everyone's pulling at.
So what I'm hearing is, and correct me if I misunderstood, that there are these different models of dealing with this problem. Same will be true for all the other problems. There's the bottom up, there's the top down, there's the Goldilocks in the middle. And right now, we haven't really made our mind up. My sense is that the administration, is minded to do a bottoms up guidelines process. I wonder if we have 25 years, we have 25 more years of 1,000 satellite constellation launches.
I think to that end, again, I be cautious here. I'm not speaking for the administration on this approach. This is just, my Earl Comstock, Policy Director of Commerce. I think that's what's evident from the Space Council's efforts is that no, we don't have 25 years to solve this problem. So, I think the philosophical approach is to say, are there collaborative methods we can use with industry to solve these problems? Are there things that we can sort of set out as guidelines, modeled behavior, whatever you want to call it? If we need to, we can always then look to regulation, and that's where obviously things like having Congress pass legislation provide some greater clarity on that. But I do think what you're seeing with the Space Council and the others is a recognition that before we kind of had this luxury. There were a small number of players. It was a very select club. There were huge barriers to getting into space. Basically, you needed a massive government effort to get there. That's no longer the case. So we're seeing faster and faster iterations by the commercial sector of how to get up there. If you fast forward 5 years from now, it's going to be a vastly different picture than it is today. If you talk to any of the companies that are doing launches, they're literally down saying, we need to get our tempo up to where we're doing a launch a week. Some might even say a launch a day. So at that kind of speed, there really is a need, and that's what the Space Council is trying to fill, is to say we need to get, we, the U.S. government, working with industry, need to get out there and start figuring out what are the mechanisms, because we do have this space treaty obligation, but more importantly, if we don't, it's just going to be a chaotic Wild West scenario, and that's not going to end well for somebody. So rather than wait till there's a real problem, we'd like to try to get in front of it and set this up. And so that's why I think you're seeing a real whole of government effort to put those kind of structures in place and see what's needed. I mean, we're not sitting here saying we have the answers. We're saying we see that there's a definite problem and it's getting bigger, not smaller. So how do we organize ourselves to get in front of it and hopefully provide a stable regime to encourage folks to come here and make the United States the flag of choice.
So we have the two sides of government, whole of government approach to try and make this work, which is really admirable. Rob, I want to turn to you because you're no longer in government. If you were advising a client who's looking at this space, who is in this space, and that person says to you, what's going to happen? What should I expect? Is it going to get more chaotic, less chaotic? What do you advise them?
So first of all, to Earl's point, an excellent point, which really kind of underscores maybe this whole conference, is the barriers to entry here are much lower and will continue to be so, right? So we can't even really imagine it, I don't think, even 5 to 10 years out. And I know people are trying hard to imagine it, but it'll probably be even more energetic and cheaper to get into this business than it was. I remember years ago when I was a commissioner talking to somebody in the satellite industry, where the most common word associated with the satellite industry is bankruptcy, right? It was just hard. You had to plan years in advance, build the spaceship, build the launch vehicle. By the time it got up there, and you insured it, by the way, and if it didn't blow up in the launch pad or somewhere in between, then it was obsolete almost within day one, because that technology was now 3 to 4 years old. So that is quickly passing, right? So I would let them know the good news is the economic barriers to entry are lower, but there are tremendous amount of logistical challenges here. I think it gets more and more complex. It'll be more competitive, and that will drive innovation and costs. It will drive costs down and innovation up, and that's all good for the consumers of these services. But at the same time, because of all the issues we've discussed regarding debris and harmful interference with radio frequency and all the rest, that's going to force a lot of difficult questions. And will, back to what I originally said, will government or governments be able to respond as quickly, both multilateral governments as well as national governments? And that is what we don't know. That's the big X factor. So when I advise clients just generally about any space that's regulated, no pun intended, any area that's regulated, regulatory risk is a big part of almost any calculation. Yeah. And so we've seen a great illustration here of how many decades these discussions and these ideas have gone on. Mike was just talking about an idea from the 80s, now 30 years hence, is being revived or revised, revived and revised. And that's terrific, but this will continue to be iterative. So my biggest word of caution to anyone getting into this business is there is regulatory risk here, and we just don't know where it all lands.
So we're going to turn to the audience for questions in a moment. So please think about, if you want to ask a question, what your question is. I just wanted to follow up with Rob on what you just said, though. One of the things that investors and companies crave most is certainty. We all do. And as you say, there is regulatory risk. What's your sense about the trend? Is there more or less certainty now that the administration's got its teeth into this problem? Is the regulatory risk going up or down?
So domestically, I think actually we've seen some tremendous leadership and focus. Some very tough issues are being met head on. It has the attention of the West Wing of the White House, throughout the executive branch, and also the leadership of Congress, right? So I think domestic policy advisors and policymakers understand that the U.S. is resurgent in this area, and that's a good thing for our economy and for our future on so many different levels: national security, geopolitics, et cetera, trade, everything. So domestically, I think we're on a good trajectory. Sorry to keep coming up with the puns. They're really totally unintentional. Internationally, I don't know. And because back to what I said at the very beginning, you've got, it used to be the Soviet Union and the US, right? And then they had primarily just the governments, right? So Sputnik was not a private sector endeavor, as I recall. And so we've come a long ways in those 60 years since Sputnik, which is hard to believe. And now we have France, India, China, others, all getting in this game with launches and services. And as it becomes cheaper, countries that we never would have thought could be in the space business are. They, at the multilateral level, at the ITU level, are all going to have their own national interests. And I think that provides, actually, you can make a case either way. So I'll try to be academic about this. You could say, if they're all getting into similar businesses, maybe there's alignment on some issues, yes. But they all are competing, so there's that regulatory arbitrage that happens, which is, and I used to joke, but it's actually serious, the most common request I used to get when I was a commissioner at the FCC, when you boil it all down, whatever argument it is, if anyone walking my door is, please regulate my rival, but not me. Okay, so that's going to go on at the international level too, right? What can we do to hobble our rivals so we can prosper or get whatever it is we want? So that, I think, becomes more complex, but feel free to disagree. Earl's not shy about disagreeing with me. So.
I would agree with you. Everybody does want their rival regulated.
This is true.
That is usually the main ask.
There's always the ask.
Mike?
I have an observation from self-reflecting on this discussion, and it's that regulating space isn't regulating space. So when we talk about regulating spectrum, right, it has to do with deconfliction and giving out or allocating a limited natural resource. You talk about space traffic management, most people think physical deconfliction or you think about remote sensing, you're thinking about national security versus private equities. And I think this is a really important observation because it's easy in the discourse for all of us to just say we're talking about regulating space. But if you begin to classify what you're talking about, not only do you identify the sort of stovepipe thinking we all carry in that subdomain, but you can then say, well, how can I approach it orthogonally, right? How can I bring something that maybe this subset of the domain hadn't considered before?
For people who aren't as smart as you, what does orthogonally mean? Thank you.
Different angle. And it might enlighten us as we move forward.
Can you spell it? I'm just teasing.
He's taking notes.
So to find different solution sets. So like, I don't want to presume what the answers are for deconfliction physically, but there might be ways to approach that don't necessarily have to resolve the same way we do spectrum, where the government says you go this way, you go that way. There might be a broader palette for us to consider about economic incentives or insurance incentives or self-interest. And I think this is a really important part of the conversation. The other thing I've noticed in our conversation is we're all operating, no pun intended, in an operational regulatory domain. And we failed to identify that when you're looking at our national interest, and I'll do that without any shame. I'm an American, I'll look at our national interest. If you look at our national interest and why we would choose to regulate a citizen or entity's behavior, there's all sorts of reasons we might do that that don't need to be implicated through an operational regulatory schema, right? We have trade compliance controls, we have export controls, we have the Signals Wiretap Act, Signals Intelligence Act. Like, there's all sorts of tools in the toolkit as a nation that might be more effective to use as opposed to regulate the physical operation of a satellite or a system.
Let me just build on that one point. I think it's an important one.
Thank you.
In sort of more colloquial English, I mean, the bottom line is, and this is certainly the experience I bring into this from, say, looking at things like the internet. The bottom line is most of the activities in space are activities that we've seen before. They may be, new technology, novel, something else. We don't have to create a whole regime to regulate space. Business arrangements in space are no different than arrangements on Earth. Same thing with spectrum, same thing with other things. There may be different policy considerations that you would bring to it, but I think that's one thing that allows the administration, when we're looking at this, say, look, this is not, we're not having to make this up out of whole cloth. There will be people who will advocate that, say this is unique, never been seen before, but the bottom line is a contract is a contract, whether it's here or it's up in space. Same thing with a lot of the spectrum things, same thing with the activities. Are you listening in on somebody's communications? Well, does it matter that you're in space versus next door? So we actually have a lot of rules and regulations that apply to activities, and you don't even have to change the law. I mean, it's just that they're there. So I think the real thing we're going to be focused on is there anything unique that we have to deal with? And then, like I said, I'll come back to, again, to the insurance regime. Don't forget there is a treaty that basically says countries are liable for things that happen in space for people that they've authorized. And that's another element that the United States can use to basically help encourage proper behavior. Is we have courts, we have things. If you're allowed to bring suit against the guy that allowed his object to collide into you, and you can effectively recover here in the United States, that's another reason why people might think of coming here and being flagged both in the United States for their own protection, and also then to avail themselves of our courts and our laws in terms of recovery for damages from other countries. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we need to sit down and look at. How can we use what's already there, not reinvent the wheel, and come up with a rational regime? And then for those few things that are truly unique to space and to the operation up there, do we need new regulation? Do we need new law? Or can we simply promote best practices that get us to the same place? I mean, I think that's really how we're approaching this, because the goal is to do a minimally invasive sort of approach to the extent we can, while addressing the significant problems and protecting the national security interests that we do have.
Rob?
And just real quick, because I know we want to get some questions, which is actually to a common thread between what they've both been saying, I think, is there are market forces here. So you never know how market forces are going to yield a nice positive result. Space policy has been very government-oriented, right? So, and not private sector-oriented, from the launches and the vehicles going up were government-owned to the treaties that govern that, et cetera. And now we're seeing this literally Space 2.0, where there's a turning point. And so what Mike was saying a minute ago sort of reminded me about spectrum policy generally. And Ronald Coase, 55 years ago now, coming up with his paper on the FCC saying how spectrum should be auctioned. Now, I'm not saying satellite spectrum should be auctioned. And by the way, I should have said at the beginning, I'm not speaking on behalf of any client of my law firm. Yeah. Is it too late for anyone to be mad at me? Can you be unmad at me? I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody, including myself. But that was considered nuts to auction spectrum. The government should hand out the license, either comparative hearing or other types of processes, very litigious usually. And actually, it was adopted under a very bipartisan basis. And Earl was one of the authors of that legislation when he was with Senator Stevens. And it has worked quite well. Again, I'm not saying satellite spectrum should be auctioned, but anyway, necessarily. Unless that's what you want, and then you agree with me. But nonetheless, the point is there are new ways of thinking that would have seemed unthinkable or impossible just a short time ago, which may resolve some of these thornier issues. And I think that's at the heart of both of what they're saying.
Good, so let's turn to questions. Before we start, I just want to get a sense of how many people have questions. So everybody who has a question, let's just see by show of hands. Okay, so I think we have quite a few people. What I think we'll do is we'll take them two at a time to make sure that everybody gets a chance. Please introduce yourself with name and affiliation. And we'll start over on this side and work our way back.
Yes, I'm Gary Barnhart with Extraordinary Innovative Space Partnerships. I found it interesting that each of the panels, in their own particular vernacular, approach this notion of a orthogonal perspective. Arguably, what we have done from a technology standpoint is basically work problems on a reactive mode, effectively after the fact. Arguably, we need an orthogonal perspective that could offer a way to get in front of the problems. I would argue from my perspective that if we thought of the functions that are to be performed and what the customer requirements for those functions are, that might offer such an orthogonal perspective. And as a mind play on this, what our company is doing is trying to look for how you create a cislunar electrical power and ancillary services utility. That will be fundamentally transformative. And how could we do that? What is the perspective that's going to enable that sort of innovation and transformation of the market?
Very good. Next question. Let's take the gentleman right at the back, since there's a microphone there.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author with Wiley Publishers, doing a series on the history of satellite industry. And the panel's conversation about space situational awareness and space debris I thought was very useful, but it highlighted two alternative views of this, or alternative perspectives. One is domestic and the other is global. The panel made clear that most of these satellite issues, frequency, debris, are global. You can't think of it in one country, another country. And then the panel also said that, well, on this question of space situational awareness, we have to decide, is it the United States Air Force, or is it the United States Department of Defense, or is it the United States Department of Transportation, or United States Department of Commerce, who should manage this? And there's a clear contrast between the global and the domestic. The domestic saying the conflict is between private sector and government, and they have to work that out. And the global being, there's India, there's China, there's Japan, there's dozens of countries that are putting debris up there. So the question I have is, does anyone on the panel believe that the issue or the problems of space situational awareness and growing debris can be solved domestically by unifying totally America's approach to this issue? And secondly, if anyone says, no, it can't be dealt with domestically, and assuming we don't have 20 years to come up with a global solution, is there any prospect of a international organization that manages, space surveillance? Or I don't even know what the answer is, but maybe it's a NATO or a UN or some multinational undertaking that would deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, just to comment on that, and I think to build off the first question too, there are lots of new activities coming, and I think from our perspective, the United States can take a leadership role in this because it is a global problem. But on the other hand, there is, I think, if you tried to wait for an international organization, some people may still be around, but a number of us won't. So I think the Space Council's thinking is, let's take a leadership role on this. Let's get out there and do this. You're going to have activities, and I love that word, cislunar space. I've had to think about it for a long time to figure out what that meant.
What does it mean?
There you go. So basically, it's an activity that's outside of orbit and out to the moon. So, we are going to see those kind of activities happening in the near future, in the next 5 years, I would say. And so we can model this. We can set out a regime where we do this. And as I said, we're going to have to look at a number of different tools related to insurance, related to possibly litigation if people are poorly behaved. But we have, as a national security matter, an interest in monitoring what's going on up there. And I think, frankly, kudos to the United States government and particularly the Department of Defense. They've done a great job of providing a wonderful public service to the world in that. But as this gets more active, it's logical to try to say, let's create a civilian agency to basically be the interface. The reality is, Department of Commerce or any other department we might pick doesn't have the resources to do that space situational awareness. That is going to be DoD. Thankfully, they have a very great interest in doing that for their own reasons. But one of the goals we have is to continue to provide that public service to the globe, again, as a means of attracting people to the United States, saying this is the place you want to come and do business. This is the place to launch your space activities. And I think if we can do that, it's going to make it very appealing for folks in other countries to not only come here, but it's also going to set a standard for the rest of the world. And hopefully we can unite the club of sort of responsible actors, whichever governments those may be, and say it's in our larger interest to have these global things. So it doesn't take 20 or 30 years in a new international organization to put that in place.
Sir, I appreciate your question, but I want to address a common misperception that you articulated. And I alluded to this earlier, but I'll reiterate it. Having data about what is up in space is distinct from being able to use that data to make a decision, which is distinct from having to make a decision either on a voluntary or a coercive basis. So to translate that, okay, in 2007, Congress decided they were going to tell DoD to provide data and a small amount of service analyzing that data for both their self-interest and for the public good. Now, that's why we're having that debate, because there's no one else in the world with that much data right now. So they've got really good data. And so if you start thinking about what do we do to make more data available, how can we allow that data to be more useful? Right? You can look at the S&T component, and you can look at the question of is there a market force to generate an incentive for people in the private sector to create data and analyze data? Does that have to be a market force which is impugned through some regulatory requirement or not? And then you can end up, once you have better fidelity of what's up there, you can then be able to ask the question, well, now since we have a much better idea of what's up there, should we talk about coercive or non-coercive behavior forcing? And I reiterate that because I'm not a scientist and it took me a while to understand, but there are things called error ellipsoids, which are around every object in space. And there's a high degree of uncertainty about where something is. So one of the things we need to do is increase our scientific fidelity of what the space environment is like.
Thank you. So let's see, let's have another round of questions. Let's do 3 this time. We'll start in the back, and then this gentleman, and then that gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Courtney Stad with Vector Launch, Tucson-based CubeSat launcher. And I have a question that's really directed toward Earl and Mike specifically.
Good.
Earl, back in the 80s, I was one of the folks that helped charter the Office of Commercial Space and then went over to DOT as one of the early directors of now AST. So I've seen both the promotional effectiveness of commerce and I've also seen the regulatory culture, and they are distinct. From your vantage point, and again, Mike, I'd like to have your legislative view of this. In a sense, what the Secretary is doing with all of his enthusiasm is bringing those two critical cultures together, if you will. And I'm, again, curious from your standpoint, what does that entail? What are the challenges?
Very good. Let's just get 2 more questions. We're running out of time. I want to get as many people to speak as possible.
Hi, Jeff Faust, Space News. What sort of coordination is there between Commerce Department and the Hill in terms of the legislative proposal for commercial remote sensing reform that was one of the recommendations of the last National Space Council meeting, and the legislation like HR 2809 and whatever is going to come in the Senate to actually create that, that change in law to enable that remote sensing reform?
And one more question over there. Yes. Microphone, please.
From Hatfield from the University of Colorado, and I wear a lot of hats. So in this case, I'm going to be speaking at a research university as a research group that launches satellites. And we're talking about here people launching thousands of satellites. In this instance, you may just want to launch one satellite that's going to be in orbit only for a few months. And that can lead to an awful lot of good research that's applicable more broadly. But a lot of this sounds like it may be very challenging or difficult for people who have an interest in, can produce lots of good research. But this is an awful lot of regulatory hoops to get through if you're just going to launch a single satellite with a limited duration.
Very good. So we'll start with you, Earl.
Okay, let me try to jump through a couple of them, maybe starting with Dale's point first. I think what you're going to see in this, again, is why we'll be looking at this. There are already people today who package launches, right? The tough part is getting your satellite up in the air first. So there are companies already out there that are packaging that. And I think one of the services they provide in that process is essentially a little bit of a buffer and an interface with the regulatory regime. So they're the ones who go to the DOT and get that worked out. They put a whole payload together, and that payload may have 30 or 40 different satellites. So what your point about it may only be up for a couple months, again, it depends on what it's doing. If it's taking pictures of the Earth, then you've got to come to NOAA and get a remote sensing license. That'll be one of the things we'll be looking at as we try to get this policy pulled together, is basically the authorization of the activity in space. So our goal is to have that as streamlined as possible. And if it really is something that's not going to image the Earth, it's going to, say, collect some kind of atmospheric data. Hopefully that's something that doesn't really involve anything more than the launch and reentry licensing. To the point about the regulation and the culture, I think that's one of the reasons the Department of Commerce is looking at this, is that the challenge of any nascent entity, though space is not that novel and new, but this idea of commercial space is that if you place it in something where it's kind of subsidiary, and right now in DOT, obviously their main focus is on the aircraft side of things. So there's a bit of a challenge for them kind of getting out from underneath the umbrella of the larger aviation industry. And as you look at commerce, that's not there. So we will be looking at the regulatory side, but we're also looking at the promotion side, and we're hopefully going to find a nice blend between those two. And in terms of the question on the coordination, obviously it's not a coordination between the Department of Commerce and the Hill. It's the administration has a position, and that's being led by the National Space Council. And then obviously we go through the usual NSC, OMB review process. So the position that gets advanced by the administration, which is still under development, will be a whole of government sort of approach. But I know Mike can speak more directly as to who he talks to down here. But we are very careful. It's not an individual activity by DOC or any of the other agencies by themselves. It's coordinated across the government.
I'm happy to report the Constitution grants every U.S. citizen the right to petition their government.
And they do.
I think I'll take that as a pass. Any other comments? Good. So I think this will be the last round of questions. So we'll just get everybody who hasn't had a chance yet.
Del Smith of Reed Smith. An observation. The problem is we no longer have a club of responsible actors. You have rogue states, which I have not heard mentioned in any part of the discussion earlier this morning or this afternoon.
No, I absolutely mentioned them. Authoritarian regime, but that's another word for a rogue state.
What did you call them?
Authoritarian regime.
Well, it's more than that.
Oh, okay. Well, whatever. The premise is the same, sir, but please go ahead.
The premise.
No, you said it wasn't mentioned on the
premise
panel, and
is
it was.
not the
Yeah,
same.
but go ahead. I want to hear.
Okay. You did not mention rogue states. You did not also deal with effective international dispute resolution. It will not come from the International Telecommunications Union. It will not come from the WARC because they can't do it. And so when you talk about the United States as the primary flag, I put to you, why not Luxembourg as the primary flag? Perhaps they're a little bit in advance, but you have to consider the players that you have and not simply figure out that it's business as usual. It says the new space era, that's what you're in, and the parties have changed and the stakes have changed and the time frame is rapidly running out.
So this is a continuation. Roger Cochetti, Joe Pelton, International Space University, and other hats. Anyway, Roger Cochetti and Del Smith, is the fact that we've talked largely in terms of U.S. reform, and there's a lot of good things happening here. But I've just returned from South Africa, where my host was Peter Martinez, who chairs the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space Working Group on the Long-Term Sustainability of Space. He is going crazy with the fact that he is trying to get consensus among more than 80 members of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and particularly he does have problems with Russia, China, Cuba, and other states agreeing to proposals that the U.S. and other people would like to see. So there is this problem that's largely international, that how do you, with all of these actors now in copious, how do you get consensus and move forward faster? You also have the issue of space traffic management. We now have some committees meeting with COPIUS and the International Civil Aviation Organization to maybe coordinate activity in that regard. Mike Mineiro has had some very interesting papers in a book that I did on what we could do moving that direction. But the key issue is, how do we get international consensus and move ahead in a timely way, because the speed of everything is getting faster and faster, and the international institutions don't have any ITU police. There is no enforcement. Only the World Trade Organization has the fining capabilities to have any teeth there. So I'm just saying the international domain is, I'm afraid, the real problem, and we don't have any significant ways to get things moving faster and to get consensus the way we used to when it was basically the U.S. and the USSR.
Thank you. Any other questions? Last call. Gentlemen, so let's wrap up. We'll start with Earl. What I'd like you to do is, obviously, we've been hearing some very trenchant questions about geopolitics and consensus. Please address those as you wish, but also just bring it back to close, and this will be your last word. How are things going to be different in this new policy regime, this reformed regime that's being set up? How are things going to be different and better in 5 years?
Well, I just say, to the gentleman's point on the international side, I think this is exactly why, President Trump has really focused on American leadership. And the bottom line is, yes, the international process is long and can be tedious. The best way to set that stage, especially in a fast-moving thing like this, is to take what we can control, which is American activity, and set a model out there for the rest of the world. So we're going to make it, as I said, we are focused on making it so that people want to come here. If you're an entrepreneur and you want to see your activity succeed, this is the place to come. We will provide that imprimatur because you do have to deal with things like insurance. You have to raise capital. You have to ensure investors that there is some certainty to your regime. And ultimately down the road, as we run into problems with these rogue states and others, there is the legal mechanism of bringing action in the U.S. court. There's still a tremendous amount of financial activity that goes through U.S. banks. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if Congress sees a need, they can authorize the seizure of assets and other things that would give us the teeth that you're probably never going to get through an international organization. So I think that's why the president has focused on directing the Space Council to take the lead on this, get out there in front, figure out how to solve the problems here in the United States, and really set up a regime that will be attractive to everyone.
I'll provide a tactical observation and then a big picture observation. So tactically, you can see demonstrated through their actions that elected leaders in this country for several years have realized that we need to do more to protect U.S. national interests and to incentivize people to operate here. If you look at the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, it established a right under U.S. courts for people to maintain rights over resources they got from outer space. Yep. And it allowed them to avail themselves to the court system. If you look at the H.R. 2809, the Free Enterprise Act, there's a provision in there which directs the president to use the ambit of national power. It's a soft directive, but the ambit of national power, essentially, to protect and promote U.S. flagged equity interest in there. Similar to if we had a flagship on the high sea, there's benefits of having an American flag on the high sea versus a Liberian flag. We want people to realize that's important. There's reasons you want to be under our jurisdictions. It comes with privileges, rights, but it comes with obligations too. There's certain things you have to do if you're a U.S. corporation or a U.S. citizen operating. At a meta level, I think, Del, one of the reasons people are starting to have this big debate and there's this tension internationally is because what happened in the Cold War was an anomaly. All right, you had a proscriptive regime with essentially a bipolar, almost tripolar space paradigm over 50 years ago. And what's happened today is a normalization of what's a typical process, sort of how the high seas developed, right? You had people building ships and going out, learning how to do things, and then coming up with rules of the road and different ways to operate. There's a few big differences. Number one, the time frames have to be really compressed now. We don't have 1,000 years for legal scholars to write all their things and come up with common rules, right? We are under a time frame crunch. Number two, because it was a government domain and it has broader equities outside of the civil sector, specifically national security equities, you have an automatic interest of major world powers in the discussion, right? And the third thing is the proliferation of technology and access and the sort of diffusion of capital and the knowledge to use that capital, which is a really good thing, is driving this debate at the domestic level. And so I think traditionally what you see is you see different states taking different domestic laws and experimenting about how they want to accede and drive their interests conforming with their international obligations, which, by the way, the treaty is a good umbrella, and people are sort of in that process now. And there's going to be, differencing of opinions. And ultimately, that difference of opinion hopefully will be resolved in a peaceful way over time. But that's the tension, I think, that you're observing. What was prescriptive is now more of a rational evolution of the process.
Commissioner McDowell, you get the last word.
So very briefly, I can't do any better than Dr. Mike and Earl here on those responses. I think to add to that, though, the only thing that's for sure is that we will see surprises. We will see pleasant surprises and we will see unpleasant surprises. That could be said about a lot of things in life. And I think it's absolutely terrific that Hudson Institute has launched, sorry for the pun again, this particular program, and hopefully becomes a series. And we do a lot of good, thoughtful work here because it's very relevant, and a lot of these very difficult questions need to be studied in a dispassionate, thorough way. And so I want to thank again Margaret Whitehead and Ken Weinstein and everyone involved, Pierre, everybody who's been working on this issue. So I look forward to more of this. So thank you very much.
So thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists for a wonderful conversation. I think we could have gone on for at least half an hour, probably another hour. I would like to thank you in particular for spending so much time with us today. We couldn't have done it without you. Do stay tuned. This is just the beginning of a process, and we look forward to continuing the debate. Thank you.